Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a brand new episode of Uprising. On today's show, the business plot. The little-known story of the Wall Street scheme to launch a fascist coup in America. As FDR's New Deal worried Wall Street, a cadre of bankers decided to replace him with the decorated Marine Corps General Smedley Butler as their fascist dictator. Here's how and why they failed. So, our story starts on November the 24th, 1934. Retired General Smedley Butler sat before a closed session of the Congressional Special Committee on Un-American Activities in New York. Though he was a two-time Medal of Honor winner with once unimpeachable reputation, Butler knew there was already those outlets like the New York Times who would call the story a gigantic hoax. He also knew, however, that if he said nothing of the business plot, a coup which was really designed by the country's most wealthy, to remove President Franklin D. Roosevelt from office and replace him with a fascist regime, could only continue. Worse still, it might succeed. May I preface my remarks by saying, sir, began Butler, that I have one interest in all of this, and that is to try to do my best to see that democracy is maintained in this country. Smedley's testimony was ultimately dismissed. The conspirators were never prosecuted. Let's find out a little bit who Smedley Butler is first. Born to a Quaker family in 1881 in Pennsylvania, Smedley Butler would rise from an underage 16-year-old soldier in Cuba to one of the most well-respected military men in the United States. Butler rose to Major General in the Marine Corps through his service in the Boxer Rebellion and across Central America before accepting his commission into the First World War. As the commander of a fort in northern France, Butler oversaw the care of more than 2 million men and earned a reputation as someone who understood the common man and deeply cared about the plight of the average soldier. Following the armistice in 1918, he accepted command at a Marine Corps base in Quantico, Virginia, and waded into politics and criticism of the current president, Herbert Hoover. Naturally, the president grew to dislike Butler. When Butler finally retired in 1931, the president snubbed him by giving it was because the president snubbed him by giving him the role of not giving him the role and giving commandant of the Marine Corps role to a younger officer. And that offended him enough to retire. So it was just as well, really, because by this time Hoover's presidency was riddled with problems. At the end of World War I, more than 3 million American troops had returned from the war to end all wars in various states of disarray. The veterans were without support in an era before the official recognition of things like post-traumatic stress disorder or the formation of the Veterans Affairs Bureau or anything resembling a GI Bill. In 1919, most veterans received just around $60 in mustering pay and a train ticket home for their trouble. The American Legion organization was consequently established to serve as a veterans union to increase their bargaining power in government and petition for more aid. In 1924, these efforts resulted in the passage of the War Adjusted Compensation Act, which promised World War I veterans with bonus pay for their lost wages in the form of a bond that would only be collectible after 20 years in 1945. This at first seemed like a reasonable compromise, but the stock market crashed in 1929, which completely changed life for a lot of veterans and for a lot of people in the country, by the way, at large. By 1932, Hoovervilles, or tent cities for the homeless and downtrodden, were a common sight across the country. When, however, a camp of around 15,000 veterans who called themselves the Bonus Army formed outside Washington, D.C., officials and politicians began to panic. Backed by some U.S. politicians, the Bonus Army demanded immediate payment of their bond debts to assist their families and boost the economy in total. This would have required more than $2 billion, roughly half, but believe it or not, of the government's budget for the year. Hoover, not a big fan of that. They argued what to do about this crowd, him and his advisors. Smedley Butler, a newly private citizen making his living as a public speaker, gave a well-received broadcast from the Bonus Army camp. "They may be calling you tramps now," Butler declared, "but in 1917 they didn't call you bums. You are the best-behaved group of men in this country today. I consider it an honor to be asked to speak to you." So pretty much pumping up his military boys. Butler added that this gathering was the greatest demonstration of Americanism that we've ever had, and urged the soldiers to remain orderly while preserving the country's faith in its veterans, which were really about all they had left at this point in time. Butler's remarks made quite a contrast when a few days later General Douglas MacArthur, who really seems to be everywhere, and a cadre of armed troops broke up the camp. Veterans and their families were chased from Washington with gas weaponry and bayonets as their tents were trampled and burned. At least 2 veterans died. 2 veterans died by the hand of their own army, the one they served in. Angered by the government's betrayal of its troops, Butler publicly backed Franklin Delano Roosevelt for that November's election to end Hoover's presidency. Butler's principled stance and bombastic entrance in the public consciousness caught America's attention. And yeah, so... However, it also caught the attention of a covert group of wealthy men who were particularly anxious about these tumultuous times. No, they weren't in trouble, but were worried about losing some of their very high standing. As part of the New Deal platform, Roosevelt promised bold, persistent experimentation to craft a country that worked for all Americans. In mid-1933, this included taking the United States off of the gold standard. The decision led Lewis Douglas, Roosevelt's budget director, to resign in protest. Douglas called the decision the end of Western civilization, and a good number of people agreed with him. FDR was also relatively unpopular with the wealthy. His plans to employ the unemployed and open opportunity to all intimidated some of the worst people at the time, conservative businessmen who had really at this point owned the modern society and the industrialization that had taken place at around the turn of the century, 1880s, 1890s. Roosevelt was damned as a socialist or communist out to destroy private enterprise by sapping the gold backing of wealth in order to subsidize the poor, wrote Jules Archer in his biography, The Plot to Seize the White House, The Shocking True Story, The Conspiracy to Overthrow FDR. By this time, Butler had become accustomed to living as a public speaker and hired particularly to speak with veterans. So when a mutual friend called him to say members of the American Legion wanted to meet with him, he was not too surprised. But when on July 1st, 1933, these men, Gerald McGuire and Bill Doyle, arrived in a chauffeur limousine, Butler grew suspicious about who exactly these wounded veterans worked for. This would be Butler's first introduction into the business plot. The following information regarding Butler's meetings would all be obtained in a 1933 testimony on the matter. This is the times where he met these men behind the business plot. According to Butler, over several visits, McGuire, a World War I soldier turned banker, asked him, this is again a man named McGuire, a World War I soldier turned banker, asked him if he would be interested in taking over the leadership of the American Legion at the upcoming convention in September. Butler pointed out that he hadn't been invited, but McGuire said he was on the delegation committee and could have him brought in as a special guest from Hawaii. After Butler declined, the banker offered some 300 to 400 men to disrupt the convention and demand the general take the stage. Butler was startled by the offer, but he decided to play along. He said he wasn't sure what he would say or how many struggling veterans were supposed to get to Chicago, or how so many struggling veterans were supposed to get to Chicago. McGuire said his organization, the Committee for Sound Currency, which is another great example of euphemistic political action organizations, had already written him a speech and produced bank statements for over $110,000, which is just under $2 million for today's standards. Again, for expenses. After Butler read the speech, he asked who had written it and why a speech about the soldiers' bonuses focused so much on returning to that pesky little gold standard. The banker answered it had been written by John W. Davis, who was a 1924 Democratic presidential candidate, former ambassador to the UK, and current legal counsel to J.P. Morgan and Company. Davis, McGuire continued, was an associate of his direct employer, who was also a soldier, financier Colonel M.P. Murphy. The why, McGuire said, was very simple. They just wanted to make sure the veterans received their bonuses with real, not rubber money, not because they actually wanted to return the gold standard because they were all incredibly rich soldiers. McGuire offered Butler checks for Murphy and another man named Robert S. Clark as a down payment to help get the necessary gang together. Butler knew both of these men from back in the Boxer Rebellion. He also knew that Murphy was a multimillionaire and had been one of the biggest backers of the American Legion's founding, fronting over $125,000, which, trust me, is a lot more than it sounds. So why would one of the Legion's founders want to overthrow their leadership? Robert S. Clark had served as under Butler in China, known as the Millionaire Lieutenant, a young heir to the Singer sewing machine fortune. Now he was a settled and successful financier, done with all that war business. When in New Jersey, asked for a speaking engagement, McGuire surprised Butler at his hotel once again to ask about gathering soldiers, and giving a speech. Butler, frustrated, said that he didn't believe McGuire actually had the money. The banker then summarily pulled $18,000, in $1,000 bills, of course, from his wallet and then threw them onto Butler's bed. Insulted, Butler said he was tired of dealing with middlemen. He demanded to speak to Robert Clark himself, and McGuire agreed. Just before the American Legion convention in Miami that September, Clark traveled by train to his old commander's home. The pair caught up, reminisced about the Boxer Rebellion, and got down to business. Clark reiterated the same pitch about gathering soldiers and getting back to the gold standard, but Butler said it didn't add up. Finally, the former officer came clean. According to Butler, Clark told him that he had a fortune of $30 million. These were uncertain times, he said, and if he had to spend half of his money to protect the other half, he would do it. All of his partners would do this too, even if that meant paying the bonuses for every soldier themselves. Roosevelt was on the verge of destroying everything with his inflation and overspending, Clark claimed. If Butler gave the speech and took control of the Legion, demanded a return of the gold standard, then maybe perhaps they could persuade Congress and the president to do so as well. But Butler then asked how Clark could be so sure that Roosevelt was abandoned such a key part of his own political platform. Clark said it was simple. Roosevelt was from a rich family. He swam in the same circles as the conspirators. The president would have the backing of some very powerful friends, and so would Butler, if he played along. The retired general said he didn't like seeing soldiers use as pawns to undermine democracy. The will of the voters, they'd spoken after all. Clark told him to stop being, or they were about to speak. Clark told him to stop being so stubborn and offered to pay his mortgage. Furious, Butler took his guest down the hall to his study. No means nobody, especially when talking with a guy like Smedley. He pointed around the room, indicating all the medals and honors he had been awarded in his career. Clark, seemingly sobered by the statement, asked to use the phone. Once McGuire answered, Clark told him that Butler would not be joining them in Chicago and they should proceed with Plan B. The only other part Butler heard was something about telegrams. Reading about the conversation and the convention after the fact, well, he didn't read about the conversation, he read about the convention, he heard the conversation personally. Butler was horrified to discover that the telegram pamphlets had fallen from the ceiling during the convention. In them, a message argued for paying bonuses and returning to the gold standard. The message had gotten out there, but not as effective, not from a popular figure like Smedley Butler. They just dropped it from the ceiling. It inspired the Legionnaires to officially support gold-backed currency. In October, McGuire visited Butler again. The general was about to embark on a nationwide speaking tour on behalf of veterans of foreign wars. McGuire bragged about the convention resolution, but Butler replied that the soldiers were no closer to their bonuses. The banker offered to pay Butler $750 for every speech he mentioned the gold standard in, but Butler still refused. This is really some, I think, remarkable stuff here. This is a guy who's faced the immense pressure of some of the most powerful figures in America at the time, risking so much money at a time where so many people didn't have anything. I'm sure he wasn't necessarily secure in his financial situation, and still, yet again, he is turning these very, very persistent, very, very powerful, very, very wealthy people down time and time again, which is really pretty insane to see. McGuire asked that he be allowed to come on the tour to recruit men. Again, Butler said no. He did not hear from McGuire again until January. Then he started receiving postcards from all over Europe. The messages described a family vacation in Italy, the French Riviera, and Berlin. That summer, when Butler's tour was finished, McGuire asked to meet him again. On August 22nd, 1934, 3 days after Hitler officially became the Chancellor of Germany, Butler met McGuire seated at a secluded table at his hotel restaurant. McGuire started talking about getting